Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is Concepts Lecture 26 on Identity and Gender. Of the many gender theorists whose work is used in contemporary art, Judith Butler is probably the most cited and influential, even though her texts may be among the least read because they're often really difficult. It's helpful to know the outlines of her work, I think, in order to understand more recent writers. So in this lecture, I'm going to focus on two of her books, Subjects of Desire, which presents a theory of identity, and then Bodies That Matter on gender. Subjects of Desire develops her ideas using psychoanalysis, phenomenology, and other fields, but her principal source, and also the subject of her dissertation, was the early 19th century German philosopher Hegel, whom I mentioned in History Lecture 17. The subtitle, Hegelian Reflections in 20th Century France, indicates the argument that Hegel's ideas were important 150 years later in French theory. The book that Butler uses is Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit from 1807, and there's the title page of it, and in particular a short section near the beginning of the book that has become known as the master-slave dialectic. This chapter or section has been enormously influential. It's behind several 20th and 21st century philosophies of subjectivity, interpersonal relations, and identity theory. The chapter isn't really about masters and slaves, or lords and bondsmen, as some people translate it. It's actually amazingly abstract. It's about the consciousness, the awareness of two entities who have an unequal relationship. They may be master and slave, but they may also be individuals or classes of people or nations. One may be a child and another an adult, or the two may be two parts of one person's mind. Hegel doesn't say. If you've ever wondered what it's like to think purely abstractly, this is an interesting chapter to try to read. Hegel begins with the idea that there's no such thing as being aware of yourself or having a consciousness of yourself unless you are aware of someone else. The first line of the beginning of this section, which I've underlined there, sets out this idea. Self-consciousness exists in itself and for itself, in that, and by the fact that it exists for another self-consciousness. That is to say, it is only by being acknowledged or recognized. So self-awareness is only possible when you feel yourself to be acknowledged or recognized. On the next screen, I have a clip from the beginning of a lecture that Butler gave in Ireland, in which she elaborates on ideas like these. And then I'm going to return to this chapter of Hegel.
With you. When we speak about becoming formed as a subject, we invariably presume a threshold of susceptibility or impressionability that may be said to precede the formation of a conscious and deliberate I. That means only that this creature that I am is affected by something outside of itself, understood as prior, that activates and informs the subject that I am. When I make use of that first-person pronoun in this context, I'm not exactly telling you about myself. Of course, what I have to say has personal implications, but it operates at a relatively impersonal level. So I do not always encumber the first-person pronoun with scare quotes. Indeed, people have asked me, do you put scare quotes around every word you use? It's like, no. But I'm letting you know that when I say I mean you too.
So that's the beginning of that lecture. So back to Hegel. Part of this chapter is about the way the quote-unquote slave is afraid for its, quote, entire being. And that fear is actually, quote, the simple, ultimate nature of self-consciousness, absolute negativity. I've underlined that at the left. So if you were to think of this as slave and master or lord and bondsman or some other unequal relation, then at the beginning of this relationship, the slave, the one entity, the one consciousness, is afraid for its entire being And that is what Hegel calls absolute negativity. Conversely, the master, quote unquote, sees that the slave is inessential consciousness, and that embodies the truth of his certainty of himself. It's always important, I think, in reading this and in thinking about it, to keep in mind its really astonishing abstraction, because Hegel really is thinking at one and the same time of real world politics and class and race. He's thinking of these things in his own way, because this is an early 19th century text, but also never forgetting that this can also be a model for all human interaction of any kind, including from the infancy, from a development from infancy to adult, or the kind of divisions that we all have within our own minds. But the first sections of the chapter are about more subtle exchange of awareness or consciousness between the two. The two are bound together. Any action by one has meaning only because, quote, it's an act done to itself as well as to the other, which Butler said in that clip that I just showed. So the two consciousnesses grow into self-awareness together. This master-slave dialectic also influenced Lacan. This is the L schema, which I showed in Concepts Lecture 18. It wouldn't have been possible without Hegel, because it also proposes a self. This is the diagram of the self with its 4 different parts that Lacan proposes. It wouldn't have been possible without Hegel, because it proposes a self that doesn't know its own identity except in the web of being seen by others and being seen. Butler says Hegel intends his master-slave descriptions as instructive fictions, but they also provide her with models of the formation of identity. Identity is Butler's modern term, and she also uses 20th century psychoanalytic and existential terms to translate and rethink Hegel. So here's a little table of those. When Hegel talks about consciousness, sometimes that's figured or imagined in Butler's text as desire or identity. Those are modern terms. Hegel uses words like slave, and Butler, for the first kind of relation, and for Butler that's self, and master, that's other, and then those two, of course, change roles. So he says, the self comes out of itself when faced with another. It realizes itself as a, quote, ecstatic being that has it in itself to become other than itself. So we find our identities in this mutual struggle with the other. A good account of this, if you want to read something else, is Kathy Ferguson, The Man Question. So gender, and again I'm going to start with a little introduction, this time not Hegel, but just a little bit about history of gender theories, especially feminism and its waves. So first wave feminism, as it's called, is principally white women from the 1870s through the 1920s advocating the right to vote, and more generally women's right advocates from Mary Wollstonecraft, and that's her in that painting, up to about the mid-20th century. Second wave feminism is a much more diverse movement, and there was advocacy for a wide range of rights. It's generally dated between the 60s and the 80s. There's Betty Friedan. Second wave feminism is also associated with the distinction between sex, understood as biologically determined, and gender, understood as socially constructed. In this way of thinking, there is no essential self, but there's a negotiation between biology and culturally expected or possible norms. Here's a slide from Concepts Lecture 23. That's Butler's Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. Here she argues that there is no sex that is not already gender. Sex no longer determines desire in this account. Desire is not given to you by your biology. Quote, which pleasures shall live and which shall die is often a matter of which serve the legitimating practices of identity formation that take place within the matrix of gender norms. So she opens by doubting that women are the subjects or agents of feminism. Quote, there's very little agreement on what constitutes the category of women. The domains of political and linguistic quote-unquote representation, there's one of her scare quotes, set out in advance the criterion by which subjects themselves are formed, with the result that representation is extended only to what can be acknowledged as a subject. So she's inverting or reversing the logic of what's usually associated with second wave feminism. Quote, my suggestion is that the presumed universality and unity of the subject of feminism is effectively undermined by the constraints of the representational discourse in which it functions. Perhaps, paradoxically, quote unquote, representation will be shown to make sense for feminism only when the subject of women is nowhere presumed. She then effectively devalues the category of women by inverting the usual way of understanding sex and gender. Butler argues against this using what's called a comparative analogy. Gender is to culture as sex is to nature. So that's a comparative analogy is A is to B as C is to D. So gender is to culture as sex is to nature. She critiques that, or she wants to abandon that in favor of this formulation. Gender is also the discursive cultural means by which sexed nature or a natural sex is produced and established as pre-discursive, prior to culture, a politically neutral surface on which culture acts. So I describe this differently as a kind of, in a diagrammatic way. So here's your comparative analogy. Gender is to culture as sex is to nature. So nature produces sex and culture produces gender. That's the usual understanding that's associated with second wave feminism. Against that, Butler argues something like this. Gender produces, quote unquote, natural sex. What counts as, quote unquote, natural, it's established as pre-discursive, as she puts it. So gender comes first and natural sex comes second. This is a very famous and controversial claim, which completely reverses and ruins the logic that you see in the comparative analogy. In the next book, Bodies That Matter, 1993, she extends this argument, saying that gender appears as performativity. We all behave as if there were male and female natures, and that creates the fiction or the belief that such natures actually exist. Gendered subjectivity is not something that can be defined for a given person. It's the sum of actions, a, quote, repetition and a ritual. She takes this idea of performing identity and performativity from Irving Goffman, and ultimately it comes from J.L. Austin, which I discussed in Concept Lecture 23. So in Austin and in Goffman, a performative speech act, a performative utterance, is one that changes the world simply by being uttered. So if I say, with this ring I thee wed, then I change the configuration of the world. Things change just because I said that. A non-performative speech act would be practically any other proposition that I could say, like, it's very hot today, something like that. It doesn't change anything. It just describes something. But a performative speech act changes things. So this idea is that gender is performative. It changes things by being performed. Gender performances are, quote, forms of authoritative speech, statements that, quote, exercise a binding power just by being uttered. And here's a short video of her making this point.
It's one thing to say that gender is performed, and that's a little different from saying gender is performative. When we say gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role, we're acting in some way, and that our acting or our role playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. To say that gender is performative is a little different, because for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. You know, I was walking down the street in Berkeley when I first arrived several years ago, and a young woman who was, I think, in high school leaned out of her window and she yelled, "Are you a lesbian?" And she was looking to harass me. Or maybe she was just freaked out, or she thought I looked like I probably was one and wanted to know. But instead I just turned around and I said, "Yes, I am." And that really shocked her. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality or something that's simply true about us, a fact about us. Actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim.
So performativity is the mode of appearance of gender. And it's not entirely clear from that example that she gave, but she argues in her text that it's not necessarily conscious. In a, quote, performative accomplishment, the social audience, including the actors themselves, come to believe and to perform in the mode of belief. That's from this essay called Performative Acts and Gender Constitution. Another term in Butler's writing is heterosexual matrix. This is her expression for the invisible and apparently natural social codes that define heterosexuality as normative and biologically sanctioned. This is a theory that's comprised of three elements: sex, gender, and sexuality. So cultural norms like the heterosexual matrix lead people to make assumptions about sexuality based on culturally conditioned observations about sex and gender. Butler is interested in strategies for revealing the fixed, quote, binary frame of the heterosexual matrix. In Gender Trouble, she writes about parody as an especially effective strategy for exposing gender as performative. One of her examples is Divine, who's on the left there, who starred in John Waters' films in the 1970s, most famously Pink Flamingos. Drag and other forms of parody, Butler says, reveal the norms without creating new binarisms. Another strategy for revealing norms of the heterosexual matrix is the abject. This is a term that was made popular by the Bulgarian-French philosopher Julia Kristeva in Powers of Horror. The abject is whatever, quote, disturbs identity, system, and order. The abject is whatever is outside of your own life. For example, and this is Kristeva's example, afterbirth or corpse. It's something that is not part of life anymore, or it's something that you no longer wish to identify with yourself. I suppose the ultimate example of the abject is shit, something that was once part of you, and now you want to take it and put it at some distance from you. Same thing with an afterbirth. These are Kristeva's examples. Abject art is also an art movement that made use of the idea for shock and for revelation. It was practiced both before and after Kristeva's book. This is one of Helen Chadwick's photographs called Meat Abstracts, pieces of meat. And abjection was also part of a revaluation of surrealism in the late 1990s, especially in the book called Formless. Butler sees the abject as a process. Genders and identities that are unrepresented become abject. This applies to things we don't let ourselves see or know about, or behaviors like Divine's. This is the famous scene in Pink Flamingos where she scoops up a bit of a dog poo and eats it. Behaviors that cross those natural boundaries, quote unquote. There's a lot of scare quotes there. It is the performative nature of these acts that produces the effect of the abject. Watching, quote, we get a production of the abject. And that's from an essay called How Bodies Came to Matter, an interview with Judith Butler, which you can get on JSTOR. Like all of these lectures, this is really only a background to a much wider field. There's now an entire generation of gender theory that's developed after Butler, including a number of criticisms and developments of her positions. And here are some starting places for more reading if you're interested. All of these people have interesting accounts and responses to Butler, and I especially recommend Toril Moy's book, What is a Woman? That in contemporary gender and identity theory, there's often a deep engagement with Butler, so it's very useful to know her fundamental positions, and I think it's even more useful to know that she started as a scholar of Hegel, and that many of the ideas in gender and identity theory can be found in condensed and abstract form way back at the beginning of the 19th century in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit.